Hello, everyone. Let's jump right in. LSS begins by saying we point out the ways in which he was dumb. We don't think you're dumb, you're just wrong. Rest assured, folks, this is the last video we'll do on LSS. For now. Now let's get to the video.
Jackson claims he wasn't talking about cladistics at the very moment he has a cladogram staring him in the face.
I showed a cladogram on screen as I discussed why Darwin took the observation of a nested hierarchy, which was known about at least as early as Linnaeus, as he used it for classification and used it as evidence for common ancestry. In making this narrative point, I showed a couple of cladograms on screen. I mentioned cladistics, but not as evidence for nested hierarchy. I did the exact opposite. The observation of a nested hierarchy is what inspired cladistics.
Go figure. I know that Jackson believes in cladistics. It's simply a method to categorize, and he goes on about it approvingly at length in his video about taxonomy, so I don't know what he's trying to accomplish by distancing himself from it, but he also doesn't answer any of the objections that I did bring up about problems with the nested hierarchies, cladistics or not.
In no way was I distancing myself from cladistics. Where did you even get that idea? LSS says that we didn't point out what was actually wrong with his 3 criticisms of cladistics, which is true. I ignored it the first time because it wasn't relevant because, as stated before, I didn't use cladistics as evidence for the nested hierarchy. But we can cover the 3 points now. First, LSS claimed that choosing and weighting characters is subjective. As we know, morphology is specified by genetics, so ultimately it's the genes that determine the relatedness of organisms. These can be sequenced and compared to give us an objective view of relatedness. By asserting that character weighting is subjective, LSS is glossing over the fact that many considerations go into determining what characters are the most relevant to building phylogenies. Like how researchers use statistical methods to determine which tree or multiple trees out of millions of possibilities are best supported by the data. And that's just the basics when it comes to understanding how trees are constructed from the data. There are still other factors to consider. We mentioned horizontal gene transfer, or HGT, and incomplete lineage sorting in the last video. These processes can influence tree building, which is why they must be considered. The same goes for convergent evolution. Researchers must carefully determine if a character is the result of common ancestry or convergence. For example, researchers are currently arguing over whether sponge choanocytes are the result of common ancestry with choanoflagellates or convergence, though choanoflagellates are still closely related to animals. It's almost as though the researchers actually care about what data goes into their trees. Second, he mentions the existence of chronological inversions, where descendants appear millions of years earlier in the fossil record than their ancestors do. This, he implies, is inconsistent with evolution. It's true that cases like this exist, but they are the exception, not the rule. Studies consistently find a good correlation between phylogenies and the order of appearance of species in the fossil record. Good, not perfect, because the incomplete nature of the fossil record is necessarily going to introduce some amount of noise to the data. Even the creationist Kurt Wise has said, quote, "Evidence for not just one, but for all 3 of the species level and above types of stratomorphic intermediates expected by macroevolutionary theory is surely strong evidence for macroevolutionary theory. Creationists therefore need to accept this fact. It certainly cannot be said that traditional creation theory expected or predicted any of these fossil finds," close quote. Cherry-picking instances where ancestors appear later in the fossil record than their descendants to argue against evolution is rather like cherry-picking 80-year-old people who've smoked a pack a day for their entire lives without getting lung cancer to prove that smoking is unrelated to cancer. The existence of outliers in a data set we expect to be noisy, but doesn't disprove the general trend. Third, he says that cladograms assume common ancestry. This is only true in the sense that phylogenetic programs attempt to construct a single tree based on the data you feed in. If you use a randomized dataset, for example by mutating a set of genes in a way that isn't constrained by common ancestry, then the algorithms that are used in cladistics cannot sort it out. The statistics would give equal support for all possible trees. Rampant polytomy would be the result. Nothing is more closely related to one as opposed to any of the others. This isn't what we see when we input real data sets. We see the clear presence of a phylogenetic signal, which is itself strong evidence for common ancestry. Both creationists and seed design proponentsists acknowledge common ancestry, though to varying degrees. How much common ancestry does LSS accept? Much like Jonathan Wells, who LSS was taking cues from for the original video, he never says. He could think species are immutable for all we know. In fact, when we talked on my channel, I asked LSS if he thought all species within the water strider genus Ragavalia were related. He said that he didn't know. Regardless, LSS doesn't understand the logic of phylogenetics. If one group of species is related to each other, then are they related to another, similar-looking group of species? If so, what about a third group? A fourth? Where does it end? It's the phylogeny challenge. Take a stab at it, LSS.
Humans have noticed this for ages, but Carolus Linnaeus was the first to construct a method of classification to describe this observation. Instead, they formed a nested hierarchy.
Sure, I'll grant that. The question is, are these patterns merely useful for categorizing, a la Linnaeus, or do they show actual history, a la Darwin? You're assuming it's the latter rather than the former. The incongruence between conflicting trees is increasing the more data that we uncover. The data needs to be filtered very carefully in order to construct these nested hierarchies. Hierarchical structure can always be imposed on or extracted from such data set by algorithms designed to do so, but at its base, the universal tree of life rests on an unproven assumption about pattern that, given what we know about process, is unlikely to be broadly true.
LSS has a tendency to make very broad, sweeping statements with little data to back up his claims. For instance, he says, quote, "The incongruence between conflicting trees is increasing the more data we uncover," close quote. This is just factually not the case. Let's look at mammals. There are very high rates of congruence among phylogenies, and there have been for years. Humans have been located as a member of Hominidae for decades. Hominidae is a member of primates. Primates is within Euarchonta. Euarchonta is within Euarchontoglira. Euarchontoglira is within Boreoeutheria. Boreoeutheria is within Eutheria, etc. Sure, there are certainly places where phylogenies can conflict. For instance, is Scandentia within Glira, Euarchonta, or basally derived compared to both? But overall, there's a large degree of congruence. Next, LSS clearly didn't bother to read the paper he's citing. Big shock. This paper, like a number of other papers by W. Ford Doolittle, is about HGT among prokaryotes, bringing new data onto the field and improving the phylogenies accordingly. Nowhere does Doolittle say evolution is wrong or that all of phylogenetics is wrong. In fact, he says, quote, "To be sure, much of evolution has been tree-like and is captured in hierarchical classifications. Although plant speciation is often affected by reticulation and radical primary and secondary symbioses lie at the base of the eukaryotes and several groups within them, it would be perverse to claim that Darwin's tree of life hypothesis has been falsified for animals, the taxon to which he primarily addressed himself, or that it is not an appropriate model for many taxa at many levels of analysis," close quote. Just read past the abstract. To explain, these authors take the view, which is not uncommon, that given the processes we know exist, we shouldn't think that phylogenetic analyses of prokaryotes will result in nice, neat, bifurcating trees. That's what they say even more explicitly in the very next sentence after LSS stops reading. Quote, "This is not to say that similarities and differences between organisms are not to be accounted for by evolutionary mechanisms, but descent with modification is only one of these mechanisms, and a single tree-like pattern is not the necessary or expected result of their collective operation," close quote. If we shouldn't expect X because of known evolutionary processes, the fact that we don't observe X shouldn't be taken as evidence against evolution. The implication of HGT is that the tree of life, when viewed at this scale, is more like a web, or it could be considered a banyan tree rather than an oak tree. In any case, in no way does this mean that common descent isn't true. It just means that the pattern of descent is different from what was originally expected. And before LSS wants to proclaim victory by concluding that there is no nested hierarchy, it should be noted that this, by and large, only applies to single-celled organisms. As the 2009 paper by Baptist et al. Makes clear, quote, "In multicellular eukaryotes, the molecular mechanisms and species-level population genetics of variation do indeed mainly cause a tree-like structure over time. In prokaryotes, they do not, close quote. The paper goes on to explain why population genetic processes in multicellular eukaryotes generally result in bifurcating, easy-to-resolve phylogenetic trees, while different processes in prokaryotes do not. This isn't some kind of desperate grasping at straws to explain why prokaryotes don't fit neatly into any tree of life. It's based on processes that we can observe being present in prokaryotes to this day.
And so you're saying Dr. Barra didn't mess up. You can keep saying he didn't goof, but he goofed. Barra used his analogy to try and convince the reader that common descent was overwhelmingly obvious, but he done goofed and it backfired because he pointed to a forbidden explanation. Design.
No rebuttal, just nuh-uh. He's still saying the purpose of Barra's analogy was to, quote, try and convince the reader that common descent was overwhelmingly obvious, but he done goofed and it backfired because he pointed to a forbidden explanation. Design, close quote. Here's the full quote from Barra's book. Quote, the accelerating pace of hominid fossil discoveries is truly dazzling. In Darwin's time, only a few Neanderthal remains were known and they were misunderstood. Today we have a whole cast of characters in the drama of human evolution. These fossils are the hard evidence of human evolution. They are not figments of scientific imagination. If the Australopithecines, Homo habilis, and Homo erectus were still alive today, and if we could parade them before the world, there could be no doubt of our relatedness to them. It would be like attending an auto show. If you look at a 1953 Corvette and compare it to the latest model, only the most general resemblances are evident. But if you compare a 1953 and a 1954 Corvette side by side, then a 1954 and a 1955 model, and so on, the descent with modification is overwhelmingly obvious. This is what paleoanthropologists do with fossils, and the evidence is so solid and comprehensive that it cannot be denied by reasonable people. There are quibbles about individual relationships, but each new discovery helps fine-tune increasingly detailed knowledge of human evolution. Close quote. LSS's original claim was not just that Barra's analogy was intended to convince readers that common descent was obvious, it was that Barra stepped in and used its analogy as an answer to the question, are similarities due to common design or common descent? We shouldn't lose sight of this, because it seems LSS is trying to slip out of his original claim. Barra's analogy was simply intended to get across the point that if you just have two quite different forms, then it might be hard to imagine how they could be related. But if you have a detailed succession of fossils, as we do in the case of hominins, it's easy to see how a gradual process of evolution could connect them. If LSS had just said, Barra's analogy illustrates the point that a succession of similar forms doesn't necessarily point to common ancestry, it can also be produced by design, then I would absolutely agree. I already said this in the very first response video. The issue is the way LSS framed the analogy to misleadingly make it sound as though Barra intended it to answer a question that it clearly wasn't. It really shouldn't be so hard to admit this. All LSS has to say is, okay, yeah, I got a bit carried away with the narrative of my original video, my bad. Oh well.
So why would the agent follow the pattern expected by common descent as opposed to literally any other pattern?
For one, it doesn't, as already explained, but for two, notice that this is a purely psychological objection. The hidden faulty assumption is that designer would create de novo rather than from a common pattern. I didn't make that assumption. I asked a question. Why would the designer follow the pattern of common descent and not any other pattern? LSS response basically boils down to, well, why wouldn't he?
I didn't say why wouldn't he. I didn't explain at all. I didn't need an explanation because your question/objection was faulty. This is merely an argument from ignorance. I can't think of any good reason a designer would do it this way, therefore a designer didn't do it. This is shoddy philosophy. This is not science.
LSS accuses me of committing the argument from ignorance fallacy. Quote, I can't think of any good reason a designer would do it this way, therefore a designer didn't do it. This is shoddy philosophy. This is not science. Close quote. I didn't make that kind of argument from ignorance. If we can't think of a good reason a designer would do something, then we don't conclude that a designer didn't do it. We just don't place a high likelihood that a designer did. In other words, we don't predict this from intelligent design. But since common descent does predict this, then this observation is evidence for the latter and not the former. But if there is something from intelligent design that predicts this nested hierarchical pattern, I'm all ears. That's why I was asking, why would a designer do it this way? And LSS keeps refusing to give a reason. Without such a reason, why should we seriously consider it as an explanation for this pattern that we observe? But since you mentioned philosophy, this is Bayesian reasoning 101. All else being equal, a hypothesis with a low prior probability comes out as less probable to be true than a hypothesis with a higher prior probability. This kind of reasoning is well justified and entrenched in the philosophy of science.
Design doesn't make any predictions while common descent does. The former is a testable hypothesis, while the latter is merely ad hoc.
Design doesn't make any predictions. Design is ad hoc and not testable. Well, tell that to the SETI researchers or archaeologists or cryptographers or forensic scientists that design isn't testable, ad hoc, and doesn't make any predictions. You know that science predicts and tests intelligent design all the time. The entire field of archaeology is about this. How do you know that the Rosetta Stone was intelligently designed and not a result of wind and erosion? Is that conclusion falsifiable? Is design ad hoc in that instance? The field of criminal forensics is all about predicting and detecting whether or not something was intelligently designed, whether or not the dead body was due to natural causes or intelligent causes. If there's a very elderly man in his bed with no signs of foul play, theft, or forced entry, you can likely falsify design as an explanation. If a young, healthy person is found on the street in the bad part of town with his wallet missing and 19 stab wounds in his back, chances are pretty good that that was not natural causes. The truth is, Jackson appears to be as ignorant about ID as he accuses me of being about evolution. This is a common objection and commonly answered. It does make scientific predictions, and this is a caricature of ID. In the end of Steve Meyer's Signature in the Cell, he makes a dozen predictions. Check them out if you like. But be careful. Many scientists who have taken time to actually read the work for themselves, rather than just the oversimplified caricatures, have themselves been convinced.
LSS goes off on a big tangent about design making predictions in fields like forensics, e.g. murder versus natural causes. He's way off course, though, because he's got the impression that the statement, design doesn't make any predictions, was a general one rather than being related to the subject being discussed before and after the statement, the appearance of traits in the history of life. The point was that ID makes no predictions about what forms should be found in the fossil record or how traits should be distributed in living organisms today. Different camps of ID, such as those who accept universal common descent, make completely different predictions from their compatriots who reject UCA in favor of multiple, independent and successive creation events. Design, as a general concept, predicts nothing observable in the history of life. It can be twisted to fit any given set of observations, with the justification the designer just wanted to do it that way, I guess. LSS refers to a video where Stephen Meyer makes predictions for ID. The prediction in question is how junk DNA isn't real, because supposedly a designer wouldn't have included that in the genome. We have discussed junk DNA before in the video series, A Critique of Intelligent Design. Junk DNA isn't disproven, and even if it was, it wouldn't be evidence against evolution, as Meyer said. But most importantly to this point, Meyer gives no explanation for why we should predict no junk DNA from design. LSS has complained about me supposedly making a psychological objection with hidden faulty assumptions about what the designer would do, which I didn't. However, here, Meyer makes assumptions about what a designer would do, and he doesn't give any reason for them. Why doesn't LSS make the same objection to Meyer, I wonder?
We don't see this kind of absurd mosaicism in nature.
May I introduce you to my friendly duck-billed platypus? Are you joking? Like, really? The platypus is not some absurd mosaicism, it is a mammal, specifically a monotreme.
Platypus isn't a mosaic, it's a monotreme. Well, what's a monotreme? An animal with these odd combination of characters. This is a common tactic, the use of technical jargon to make it appear as if an answer was given when it actually wasn't. Back in the day, people were given opium to help them sleep, not knowing how it actually worked. The explanation was given, oh, it has a dormitive virtue. In other words, it makes you sleepy because it makes you sleepy. Given the illusion of an answer without the hard work of actually giving an answer. Evolution is replete with this kind of scientific-sounding non-answer. What causes new genes to evolve so rapidly? Well, it's their hyperimmutability. What is hyperimmutability? The ability to change fast. Why can they change fast? Because they can change fast. How do we explain the origin of two similar genes in two widely disparate lineages? Convergent evolution, of course. What is convergent evolution? The presence of two similar genes in two widely disparate lineages.
LSS quotes me saying it's not a mosaic, it's a mammal, specifically a monotreme, then goes on a long rant about how simply using the word monotreme isn't a rebuttal and is a non-answer, before finally getting to the next sentence where I give a longer answer about how it's not a mosaic. I'd expect this kind of thing if he were recording a live response, but obviously he made the video while knowing full well that I had a longer answer to this point. So why go on a long rant about how I gave a non-answer by saying the word monotreme?
The bill of the platypus is not made of hard keratin like that of a duck. It's covered.
He goes on to talk about how the duck-billed platypus is not a mosaic because its similarities are merely superficial. This argument cuts both ways, though, because many of the most common putative homologies are also only superficially similar. I'm happy to give up on the duck-billed platypus because of its superficiality, but I doubt you're willing to be consistent here and give up the superficial homologies with different developmental pathways and construction methods. If you want more examples, just look at Convergent Evolution. This is the ad hoc explaining away of the many characters that fall outside the expected nested hierarchy.
LSS says that we say all the mosaic traits of the platypus don't count because they're actually just superficial, which is untrue because some of them are characters that make perfect sense, e.g. mammalian fur and laying eggs. But goes on to say that this can also be applied to many of the most common putative homologies, so if we were being consistent, we'd dismiss those as homologies too. However, while I have provided detailed explanations for why some of the traits were indeed superficial, like how those electroreceptors of the platypus were structurally more similar to sweat glands than the electroreceptors of fish, LSS doesn't provide any examples here, like usual, so we don't really have anything to respond to. If he wants consistency, he should back up his arguments with more than just vague assertions.
The biggest flaw in textbook descriptions of homology is that they, like Wells and, long story short, tend to confuse the definition of homology with the diagnosis of homologous features.
I haven't made this mistake, but the NCSE is right that many textbooks have and still do. The NCSE's position is, again, that homology is a conclusion or diagnosis from other evidence. It's just a label added after the evidence is in. Homology isn't evidence itself, as they say. They point elsewhere for the evidence to support the label. I'm saying the same thing the NCSE is. You seem to be the one that's confused. It'd be great if textbooks not only avoided the circular reasoning as the NCSE encourages, but also if they showed the many difficulties and problems with the argument as well, so that students can think critically.
LSS says the NCSE agrees with him that homology isn't evidence for common descent, it's just a label applied afterwards. This is not the NCSE's position, as made painfully clear elsewhere in the same article that LSS shows on screen as he's talking. Quote, "If the pattern of relationships looks like a genealogy, it would be perverse to deny that the trait reflects common ancestry or that an evolutionary relationship exists between the groups." Close quote. We look at the pattern of a trait in different species and it looks like it follows a genealogy. This is both evidence that the trait itself is homologous and that those different species are related through a genealogy. When we compare multiple traits and see the same pattern, the same is true again. In this sense, when we say homologous traits are evidence of evolution or common ancestry, we're referring to the fact that these traits follow a pattern indicative of common ancestry, so are therefore evidence for that hypothesis.
LSS quotes one line from Talk Origins at the bottom left of the screen. To mine this line out of context, LSS misrepresents Talk Origins as if they were claiming that nobody would make this mistake.
You've again misunderstood my reason for including the reference, and that I actually agree with the thrust of the second part of the quote. When researching for these videos, I try to find the best objections and include them so that people can see both sides. If they meant to say that homology shouldn't be used in a circular manner, I agree, of course, that's what I was saying. But what they actually say is it isn't used in a circular manner, and that's just false, as I showed in my original video. In the second part of their comment that you say I overlooked, they simply say that the homology label gets added after the evidence for common ancestry is already in. That's perfectly fine. There's no disagreement with treating homology as a label or a conclusion from other evidence. That's perfectly acceptable. That doesn't refute what I'm saying, that's exactly what I am saying. Homology is an evidence, it's a label after the fact. Now, the question is whether or not that other evidence is any good, and the second half of my video is dedicated to looking at that exact thing. I'm really surprised that you missed this so badly again.
First, he says that he cited the first sentence of the Talk Origins page because he likes to include the best objections so that people can see both sides of the argument. Well, if that was the case, why did he only quote the first sentence and not the whole thing? Does he really consider that is not true, the substance of the first sentence, to be the best objection he could find for his audience? Second, if it was included as an objection, why is LSS now saying he agrees with the second half of the quote? The first sentence was obviously intended to speak for the field of evolutionary biology, not on behalf of literally everyone ever, so it's perfectly justified. The Talk Origins article is making the same point as the NCSE, that homology as evidence and label isn't circular because it relies on an external referent, the pattern of traits.
Next, LSS gets to the part where we criticize him for saying more and more people are seeing the problem for what it is while citing two papers written literally decades ago. His only response to this is, and I quote, "Huh."
I thought the silliness of your objection went without saying once it was pointed out, but I guess not, so I'll spell it out for you. Arguments that rest on faulty premises and strained reasoning are not helped at all by the passage of time. 10 or 20 years can be a virtual eternity in modern science, I get that, but in logic, not so much.
We objected to him saying more and more people, present tense, are objecting to this use of homology when referring to decades-old papers. Now he's given up on trying to defend that claim and instead responds by saying that just because the objections are old doesn't mean they're wrong. I mean, I agree, but that wasn't our objection.
LSS then proceeds to read the same quotes from those papers that he used, apparently not realizing that these papers are much longer and contain more nuanced arguments compared to his simplistic way of dismissing homology as evidence for evolution. The authors also did not reject homology from the evolutionary paradigm as irrelevant, far from it.
Jackson says that these papers were much longer and they believed in evolution too. Fine, of course the people in papers quoted believe in evolution and often go on to try and explain the various problems that they bring up. You can read in most any paper when a scientist presents a problem, they will generally try to present a solution. Quoting someone who is biased against your position, like I do, lends a lot more weight to an argument than someone who is biased for your position. Even if they go on to try and explain away the problem, the point is still worth considering, as well as asking if their explaining away of the problem was any good or not. Imagine if a man was on trial for murder and his mom gets up on the stand and says, "Yeah, old Johnny, he has always been very violent and, one time I did overhear him threatening her on one occasion. But I don't think he committed the murder because..." And even if she goes on to explain away the problem, do you think the prosecution isn't going to use that because in the end her conclusion is that he didn't do it? Not a chance. She's biased in favor of the suspect, and that makes her testimony that much more compelling for the prosecution. This is not a quote mine, this is not misleading, this is how arguments work. Even if she does go on to explain away the evidence, the facts are still there and it's left for us to judge whether or not the argument holds. Cries of quote mining seem to only be heard from people who want to avoid addressing the problem raised. Jackson doesn't address the quotes, he tries to distract from them.
He says quoting someone with a bias for your opponent's position has more weight than quoting someone with a bias against their position. I agree. But no one implied that the fact that they accepted homology, by the original definition, as evidence for evolution meant that you were quote mining or that their objections to the current definition of homology hold less weight. It was mentioned as a side point. Our objection was that you were claiming these authors had exactly the same objections to the definitions that you do, which isn't the case, as their arguments were much more nuanced, although still I would argue wrong. I would argue that their arguments have indeed been heard and evidently dismissed by the scientific community, as despite their protests, the definition of homology has remained unchanged in the decades since they published their articles.
Then LSS goes on citing a textbook by Mark Ridley as evidence that more and more textbooks are rejecting the circularity of homology. However, this textbook has a whole paragraph explaining how homology is evidence for common ancestry. And again, it does that in a way that isn't circular at all.
No, you misunderstand me again, unfortunately. The point isn't that the argument from homology is necessarily always circular. It doesn't have to be constructed that way. It just very often is. This textbook shows that you can define homology in the pre-Darwinian sense and avoid the mistake.
LSS says his point is that if you use the pre-Darwinian definition of homology, that's just fine. You avoid the mistake of calling the pentadactyl limb a homology in the sense that it is inherited from a common ancestor, while simultaneously using it as an evidence for evolution. But this is the point. We still discover homologous, in the evolutionary sense, traits using the same kinds of methods as for the pre-Darwinian homologies, but then when the pattern of these traits follows a genealogical distribution, we conclude that it is homologous in the evolutionary sense and name it so. As described above, this isn't circular. Once again, this whole confusion comes down to what is meant by the phrase homologies are evidence of evolution. LSS, and Wells, think it's a circular loop that might go something like this. These two traits in these two species are homologous. They were inherited from a common ancestor. How do you know they're homologous? Because these two organisms share a common ancestor. How do you know they shared a common ancestor? Because these two traits are homologous, which means they were inherited from a common ancestor. And round it goes. In fact, the argument goes more like, these two traits in these two species appear morphologically and developmentally similar and are present in two species for which we have sets of fossils showing a gradual divergence of this trait from an intermediate trait. Therefore, I will call these traits homologous, which means they were inherited from a common ancestor. How do you know they're homologous? Because of the data I just described. How do you know they shared a common ancestor? Because of the data I just described. A piece of data that implies two traits and two species are derived from a common ancestral trait necessarily also supports that these two species are derived from a common ancestral species. The same data that supports homology supports common ancestry. When we say homologies support common ancestry, we're referring to the many overlapping pieces of data, like this, that tell a consistent story.
Hennig, 1966, argued that the relationship between homology and ancestry isn't any more logically circular than the rest of science, where hypotheses are constantly tested against the larger theory every time when new data is available.
Although that's fine, but we've dealt with this already. If he's defining homology in terms of common ancestry and then using it as evidence for common ancestry, he's simply wrong. It's logically inescapable. If he isn't doing that, then we're all good. The term reciprocal illumination sheds no light on the question at hand.
This is a total non-answer. We made it quite clear that Hennig's reciprocal illumination escapes the circularity while maintaining the definition of homology and keeping it as evidence for common ancestry, as we've explained ad nauseum, testing data against theory, updating theory, and testing new data against this updated theory is the bedrock of all science. Not circular reasoning. The consistencies of homologies are evidence for common ancestry because the consistencies of homologies suggest underlying data is consistent with common ancestry.
This tree was just the one with the maximum likelihood, meaning the branching order of this particular tree gives the highest average likelihood among all possible trees that can account for the data that was used. Bear in mind that with even just 10 species, there are over 34 million possible trees you can reconstruct.
Jackson basically says there's lots of possible trees, so it's no big deal, it's hard finding the right one. The point is that rather than asking whether or not the data fits a tree at all, that's assumed from the outset that the data will fit some tree. The only question being examined is, which tree is best? This is just one example of many. You can't just hand wave it away. Phylogenetic incongruities can be seen everywhere in the universal tree, from its root to the major branchings, within and among the various taxa that make up the primary groupings themselves. These incongruities are not minor statistical variations, and the general failure to converge on a single topology has some researchers calling for the relaxation from, quote, tree thinking.
No one is hand-waving anything away. The point is that you claim the tree was wrong in a way that undermined evolution or common ancestry, but we pointed out that this analysis yields essentially a ranked list of all the possible tree topologies, and sometimes there's very little difference in how supported, say, tree topology 1 and tree topology 500 are. If the congruent tree is still very well supported, even if it's only in the top 3,000 ranked tree topologies, then the fact that this is in the top 3,000 out of 34 million is obviously significantly better than just a random guess. There is still some signature of a phylogenetic signal, even if it might not be extremely strong in this case. This is where statistical methodology becomes important. We also pointed out that even in the maximum likelihood tree, the discordant nodes were not well supported by the data, while the congruent ones were, which means that the data didn't significantly support any of the discordant relationships. Such weak discordancies are not good evidence against common ancestry at all. Again, while talking about there being more incongruence, LSS shows on-screen papers by Wose and Baptist et al. About HGT in microbes, defying a simply bifurcating tree, which is trivially true and not a challenge to evolution in the slightest, as I explained earlier.
The branching order of the other taxa, including Tarsius bancanus and Limmercata, cannot be determined from the data, close quote. Once again, completely refuting the claim that all genes should always show the same tree, and it blows the cytochrome B argument completely out of the water.
Either you have grossly and epically misunderstood my original point, or this is one of the best examples of a bald-faced Eddie Haskell ploy I've ever seen in my life. Go ahead and take what I was arguing against and act as if I was arguing for it. I didn't make that claim. That was the expectation of the evolutionists, and it's obviously false. That's what I was saying. How can you misunderstand this? In what universe does this harm my argument? That was my argument. The genetics don't match, and it's a giant frustration. To quote myself, their expectations were squished like a soggy old grape.
Okay. I wasn't implying that LSS was claiming all genes will show the same topology. It's that he's claiming the Darwinists or evolutionists expect all genes to show the same topology. By explaining some of the basic concepts of how phylogenetic analyses are actually done, I referenced the paper, made the point that we do not expect all genes to result in the same topology in phylogenetic analyses. So pointing to examples of weak discordances doesn't damage evolution in the slightest. It refutes the cytochrome B example as an example of a well-supported discordant phylogeny, and poorly supported discordant trees just don't cut it. LSS's claim isn't that the data can be noisy, leading to poorly supported nodes, but that it is starkly contradictory, leading to well-supported discordant nodes. He hasn't said that directly, but that's the only anti-evolutionary claim that would make sense for him to support. Finally, LSS completely ignored minutes 1610 to 1820 of my last response, which is a shame because it was highly relevant, all about the general problem of him citing incongruences as evidence against common descent. If only he'd paid attention, I wouldn't have had to repeat myself so often again in this new script. One last thing, Nesslig 20 has made a post on the League of Reason forum where he goes into the arguments in more detail. He also invited LSS to come on and discuss these points in a written format. As I said, this is the last time we'll be responding to LSS on homology. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.